Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're going to unpack some really fascinating arguments from political commentator Victor Davis Hanson. We'll be looking at his specific theory on how a highly unpredictable style of diplomacy has, in his view, radically shifted global power dynamics in America's favor over the last 5 years. It's definitely a controversial perspective, but we're going to break down exactly how he believes this unorthodox strategy has reshaped the globe and why these shifting alliances matter so much for global stability. So let's dive right into this quote because it really forms Hanson's core thesis. The fundamental idea here is that volatile rhetoric and the whole art of the deal persona, they're actually calculated diplomatic tools, not just chaotic drawbacks. It's a really interesting lens to look through. Basically, Hanson is saying if you get bogged down in analyzing just the rhetoric, you're going to miss the actual physical shifts that are happening right now in international relations. To map out these geopolitical shifts, we're going to take a global tour based on the source material. We'll cover 1. The power of unpredictability. 2. Shifts in the Western Hemisphere. 3. Pressuring Europe and NATO. 4. Weakening Russia and China. 5. The Middle East and deterrence. And finally, 6. Restoring American civic history. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1. The power of unpredictability. Now, the source defines diplomatic unpredictability as a pretty unusual style of statesmanship. It relies on boisterous threats, shifting positions, and volatile rhetoric to force action. Hanson argues that, sure, 3 a.m. tweets and crude remarks might totally rankle the West, but what's the actual result? Well, he claims this very fluidity creates tremendous leverage. By keeping foreign leaders constantly off balance, this strategy literally forces other nations to take the United States more seriously, purely out of a fear of what might happen next. Moving right along to Section 2, shifts in the Western Hemisphere. The source draws a really stark contrast between the region 5 years ago and where it stands today. Think back to 5 years ago. Hanson notes that Chinese surrogates were controlling Panama's entry points, and Russia heavily influenced Venezuela, which, by the way, sits on the world's second largest oil reserves. Fast forward to today, and the source argues the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the U.S. should be the dominant political power in the Americas, is very much alive and kicking. The Chinese influencers are reportedly out of Panama, and a massive shift toward pro-U.S. governance is gaining momentum across the continent. And this perfectly illustrates Hanson's point. Governments across Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Argentina are now supposedly staunchly pro-U.S. But they aren't just aligning diplomatically, they're directly copying American protocols. We're talking about implementing tough-on-crime initiatives, embracing free market economics, securing their own borders, and halting the export of prison populations. The source argues this emulation has created a radically different, tightly U.S.-aligned hemisphere. Next up on our tour is Section 3, pressuring Europe and NATO. To put this into perspective, the sheer scale of this shift here is wild. Just 5 years ago, only 6 NATO nations actually hit their 2% GDP defense spending target. But through threats and intense job-owning from the U.S., nearly 30 out of 32 nations have now agreed to hit that 2% goal, and many are even pledging to push toward 5%. So how exactly was this achieved? Well, Hanson points specifically to the threat of abandonment. When the U.S. threatened to just walk away from free-riding nations, like literally telling countries like Spain they could go form the Spanish Empire again, or calling out Canada's defense deficits, they quickly reversed course. In fact, Hanson notes that Canada is now projecting a move toward that ambitious 5% defense spending goal, just to avoid being left unprotected. And as a direct result of this tough, unpredictable posturing, the source notes that Europe is now poised to spend $500 billion in further defense readiness. That is a massive financial commitment. Alongside that, Hanson argues Europe is shifting away from what he calls green mania, pivoting right back to reliable nuclear power and natural gas to ensure they maintain their industrial and military strength. Let's shift our focus to adversaries in Section 4, weakening Russia and China. Economically speaking, the source states China is facing a severe contraction. They can reportedly no longer afford to import their previous 14 to 15 million barrels of oil a day. That number has dropped down to 10 million. Hanson argues this effectively ends Beijing's era of running trillion-dollar surpluses and completely halts their ability to fund those expansive Belt and Road enclaves in places like Latin America. So the crucial takeaway here is that while adversaries weaken, the United States is thriving. The source highlights that the U.S. is growing its economy at nearly 2.5% GDP and is now spending a massive $1.5 trillion on a military that is reportedly exceeding its recruiting targets. Hanson argues this capability gap is widening significantly in America's favor, which fundamentally secures U.S. interests abroad. According to the source, the current state of these two powers looks pretty grim. For Russia, they've lost sanctioned oil flows, lost a client state in Syria, and now Ukrainian forces are authorized to strike their refineries. For China, their shoddy air defenses were exposed, they lost their Latin American foothold, and their economic grip is loosening due to those oil import issues. Hanson argues that militarily and industrially, both nations are currently at their absolute weakest point in 50 years when compared to the United States. Stop number 5, Middle East and deterrence. Hanson poses this exact question to highlight just how dramatically the diplomatic landscape has been inverted. I mean, historically, this level of cooperation was completely unimaginable. But today, a shared recognition of regional threats has led to unprecedented security alliances that completely bypass traditional diplomatic expectations. He juxtaposes these highly coordinated new alliances against Iran, a nation of 93 million people. Despite its size and historical threat level, Hanson argues that Iran's military and nuclear industrial complex is currently being systematically neutered, exposed by recent strikes that bypassed their air defenses in a matter of hours. This all builds into what the source outlines as a new doctrine of disproportionate deterrence. The formula is incredibly strict. If an adversary attacks U.S. interests, the U.S. hits back, inflicting 10 times more damage. By targeting vital dual-use infrastructure, like taking out rail bridges, generation plants, or Caspian Sea shipping routes, the U.S. basically ensures adversaries are militarily incapacitated for decades if they dare to strike first. Finally, Section 6, Restoring American Civic History. To ground this geopolitical strength domestically, Hanson actually pivots to a specific cultural solution for America's future. As the country approaches its 250th anniversary, he highlights a new book release titled Finding Our Words, Words That Made America. He presents this compilation as a vital tool to restore civic leadership, historical understanding, and cultural appreciation right here at home. The collection gathers historical American speeches, many of which are honestly almost forgotten today. The source heavily promotes this specific compilation, which features conservative commentators and military figures reading the audio versions as his recommended resource for citizens to really rediscover the words that originally defined the American mission. We're going to end this explainer on Hanson's own final thought, which is a really profound question that leaves us something to ponder. While the source strongly argues that the world is currently much more aligned with U.S. interests thanks to this unorthodox diplomacy, Hanson asks how future historians will ultimately judge this era. Will the tangible overseas triumphs outweigh any potential long-term damage to traditional bilateral goodwill? It's a fascinating lens through which to view modern statesmanship, and it leaves us to ask, do the ends justify the unpredictable means? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.